It was like learning baseball from a fellow who was batting 400. It shaped my professional life.
There are two rules of investing, according to Warren, and he learned this from Ben Graham.
Rule number one, never lose money. Rule number two, never forget rule number one.
Ben Graham basically coined the term value investing. He believed in careful scrutiny of a company's financial statements, and that if you bought value, it would eventually prove out.
A few years ago, I went to Amazon, and sure enough, they had this manual there. So, while reliving my youth, other guys were going to Amazon probably and buying old Playboys or something, but I bought old Moody's manuals instead. And when I got out of school, I started selling stocks. I was 20 years old at the time and looked about 16 and acted about 12. So I was not the most impressive salesperson anybody ever met. But what I would do was I went through page by page looking for possibly undervalued stocks.
Is this like going through an old family album?
Better. When I got out of business school at Columbia, I developed pretty decent skills in terms of business, but I hadn't really come to terms with the world exactly.
What were you like around girls back then?
Bad. I was sort of out of the swing of things there for a while. I went to my 60th reunion. There's a girl there. I took her out one time to the Uptown Theater in Washington, and I asked her whether she remembered what movie we saw, and she said, no, I don't remember that. And then she said, but I do remember one thing. And like an idiot, I said, what was that? And she said, well, you picked me up in a hearse. And it was true that I owned a half interest in a hearse when I was in high school, which was not the smoothest thing, or coolest, as I would say now, the thing that you could do on a date. There were two turning points in my life. Once when I came out of the womb, and once when I met Susie, basically. She was the girl, yeah. But it took her a little longer to figure out I was the boy.
I was going to be his youngest sister's roommate at Northwestern. So I walked into their house, and he was sitting in this chair, and he made some sarcastic quip. So I made one back. I thought, who is this jerk? And that's how we met, yes. Listen, Warren is smarter than you even know. His brain is going all the time. And my dad said to me, now you have to understand about him. You're not going to have discussions with him like you would most normal people. But he has a heart of gold.
He was just totally enamored of her, and why not? And she of him. She'd sit on his lap all the time, and he'd stroke her hair. It was softening him. Susie was really kind, considerate, and she was the balancing force.
I just got very, very, very lucky. But I was a lopsided person, and it took a while, but she just stood there with a little watering can and just nourished me along and changed me. Somebody once said that the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they're too heavy to be broken. I had been terrified of public speaking. I couldn't do it. I'd throw up. And I knew if I didn't cure it then, I'd never cure it. And so I saw an ad in the paper for the Dale Carnegie course, which worked on developing your ability to speak in public. And I went down there.
Be sincere. A good smile has the same effect as a puppy's tail. When a puppy wags...
They made us do all these crazy things to get out of ourselves, and so we stood on tables and did all kinds of things. If I hadn't have done that, my whole life would have been different. So in my office, you will not see the degree I got from the University of Nebraska. You'll not see the master's degree I got from Columbia University, but you'll see the little award certificate I got from the Dale Carnegie course. As a matter of fact, every week, the instructor would give a pencil to whoever had done the most with what we'd learned the week before. And so in the fourth or fifth week, I proposed to her mother, and she said yes. And so that week, I won the pencil, and I also got engaged. I mean, it was an incredible week. One day it was kind of interesting because I couldn't see anything without my glasses, and I was so nervous that I just decided to take off my glasses and I wouldn't be able to see all those people out there. She was 19 when we got married, and I was 21. But she was so much more mature than I was, there's no comparison. She was a better person than I was. But when you get married, it's not a question of saying I'm going to put a 14% factor in for humor and 17% for intellect and 22% for looks. It doesn't work that way. I knew it was the right decision, and it was.
You could live anywhere in the world. Why do you choose Omaha, Nebraska?
Yeah, I love it. I was born about a mile from here, and I've never had a bad experience in Omaha. Omaha and Nebraska are home to me. Everything about it seems like home. It's a pace, it's relationships. There's a lot of continuity, there's a lot of community, there's a lot of friendship. It's a very solid place and friendly place in which to grow up and in which to conduct a business. When I came back to Omaha in early 1956, I had no idea what I was going to do. But a few months after I came back, some members of the family said, what should we do with our money? And I said, well, I'm not going back in the business of selling stocks, but if you would like to join me in a partnership, I said, I'll be glad to do it. So within a couple of months after coming back, I set up the first partnership. I wrote all the checks individually. I filed 11 income tax returns. I took delivery on stocks for all the different companies. I was a one-man band there for 6 years.
Warren would sit upstairs in his little office there, and I would bring up the name of a company, and most of the time, he knew much more than I did about the company. He'd know how many shares were outstanding, he'd know the capitalization, he'd know the earnings. It was absolutely incredible. I mean, when Warren said something, it meant a heck of a lot. And I think all of us paid a lot of attention to Warren when he took a definite stand on something.
When I first met Warren back in 1959, I recognized immediately that he was a very intelligent person.
For the last 4 or 5 years, the stock market has been booming along and presumably forecasting better business, which has really not materialized. So maybe the stock market is really correcting a previous incorrect forecast this time rather than making a new correct one.
He made a lot of money buying thinly traded securities that were incredibly cheap statistically.
Warren was at that time dealing with small companies, and his investments often were to buy a company that you could figure was a discarded cigar butt, but it had one more smoke in it. And he wanted to buy at the right time to be able to benefit from the one smoke.
The first partnership started with $105,100. I put up the 100 and the other people put up the 105,000. And then at the start of 1962, I moved to Kiewit Plaza. And by the time I moved to Kiewit Plaza, we had $7 million invested, and a fair amount was profits. I was then renting a house. I never owned a house to that point. And then 2 years later, I bought the house I live in today in 1958. We had 3 children, Susie and I. And we had them young, incidentally, which was, I think, a very good thing. My daughter Susie was born here. I named her Susie just like that as soon as I looked at her, because she looked just like her mother. And she was a cinch. And then Howie was, you know, this absolute bundle of energy, which made things very difficult for Big Susie for a while. Peter again reverted back to Susie's personality, and he was an easy child.
Well, you know, I would describe my childhood as normal, but who knows what normal is? People often think, you know, well, Warren Buffett was this famous rich guy. He was not famous and he wasn't rich when we were growing up.
What I saw first and foremost, day in and day out, was consistency. Every day we'd hear the garage door close in the house, and then like clockwork, my dad would come in the door, I'm home, and we'd all eat dinner together, which I think surprises a lot of people.
My dad used to rock me to sleep at night and sing Over the Rainbow. So I have this insanely sentimental attachment to that song. I've always had a really close relationship with him.
I've got 3 very different kids, and they've got a common heart, which they got from their mother. She did most of the work, by far, of bringing up the children, which was probably a good thing. They have more of her qualities than mine, which I would recommend.
Well, my mom was the biggest part of my life growing up. Even though I got disciplined on a regular basis, and she was usually the one doing it, she was still my best friend. She was somebody who would help anybody. I mean, whether she knew them or didn't know them, or maybe even didn't agree with them, she would still help them.
She was incredibly empathetic, and she was interested in every person individually. She never cared about money or business at all.
I mean, he would go around saying, I'm going to be the richest man in the world. And I think, well, it's like somebody says I play music and I'm going to be Mozart. I don't know. How does anyone know? How does anyone know, you know? So that was okay. I don't really care about that.
I would say that Susie led Warren toward changing his political views. He grew up as a young Republican. His father was a Republican congressman. But Susie saw things in different ways. She was the catalyst.
When the children were growing up, I was very involved in civil rights. I was immersed in it, and I think that's what made Warren a Democrat. He would go with me to hear speakers.
I remember that speech that Martin Luther King gave. That was one of the most inspiring speeches I've ever heard.
I come to say to you this afternoon,
Took me right out of my seat. My wife was with me, and we both had the same experience. It was interesting. In that speech, he talked about truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, but that scaffold sways the future. Well, he was going to be dead in 6 months, but that scaffold did sway the future. My wife was more active than I was, but I was 100% with her mentally. I was just working a little more on my own investments. But it did make a difference what we were going to do with the money after we made it. I thought I would pile it up over the years, then she would unpile it in terms of running one very large foundation. And I was particularly good at compounding money, and therefore society would benefit by waiting. I was genetically blessed with a certain wiring that's very useful in a highly developed market system where there's lots of chips on the table. And, I happen to be good at that game. Ted Williams wrote a book called The Science of Hitting, and in it he had a picture of himself at bat and the strike zone broken into, I think, 77 squares. And he said if he waited for the pitch that was really in his sweet spot, he would bat 400, and if he had to swing at something on the lower corner, he would probably bat 235. And in investing, I'm in a no-called strike business, which is the best business you can be in. I can look at 1,000 different companies, and I don't have to be right on every one of them, or even 50 of them. So I can pick the ball I want to hit. And the trick in investing is just to sit there and watch pitch after pitch go by and wait for the one right in your sweet spot. And if people are yelling, "Swing, you bum," ignore them. There's a temptation for people to act far too frequently in stocks simply because they're so liquid. Over the years, you develop a lot of filters. And I do know what I call my circle of competence. So I stay within that circle, and I don't worry about things that are outside that circle. Defining what your game is, where you're going to have an edge, is enormously important. I bought the first shares of Berkshire in 1962, and it was a northern textile business destined to become extinct eventually. And it was a statistically cheap stock in a terrible business. Berkshire Hathaway was closing mills, and as they closed mills, it would free up some capital, and then they would repurchase shares. So I bought some stock with the idea that there would be another tender offer at some point, and we would sell the stock at a modest profit. And at one point, the management asked me at what price we would tender our stock, and I said $11.50. And the tender offer came out a few months later, and it was at $11.03, which is an eighth of a point cheaper. And that made me very mad, so I just started buying more stock. I just felt that I'd been double-crossed by the management, and in May of 1965, I bought enough so we controlled the company, and we changed the management.
That was a pretty silly way to behave, as Warren has recounted in retrospect. One of the reasons Warren's successful is he's brutal in appraising his own past. He wants to identify misthinking.